Town, the University of Witwatersrand, as well as his master's from the University of Warwick. He worked for a year as an industrial relations officer with Mobil Oil before joining the British Labour Party as a secretary on Africa and the Middle East in 1979. In 1984, Martin joined the BBC, working primarily on Africa. He has reported from many parts of the continents, but specialized in the Horn and Southern Africa. This involved traveling twice to Eritrea during its long war of independence. He became Africa editor, BBC World Service News in 2003, and retired from the BBC in October 2013. Martin Proud has advised the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the US State Department, and the European Parliament. He has written a number of books. Amongst them are Understanding Eritrea, Inside Africa's Most Repressive State, Hearst, October 2016, Ethiopia and Eritrea, Allergic to Persuasion, Royal Institute of International Affairs, 2007 with Sally Healy, Unfinished Business, Ethiopia and Eritrea at War, Red Sea Press, 2005, editor with Dominic Jacquot, and excuse me, sorry, because I keep phone. And okay, yeah. 2005, edited with Dominic Jacquot, War in the Horn, Royal Institute of International Affairs, 1999 with Patrick Giggs. And now let me introduce you to Dr. Fiona Mihan. Dr. Fiona Mihan is a rural development expert and a gender specialist who has been involved in Tigray since the early 1980s, including coordinating an international NGO aid consortium operating across border from Sudan into Tigray. She also worked for the TPLF Foreign Relations Department during the 1980s Ethiopian famine and civil war. After the end of the war in 1991, she worked in Ethiopia for 12 years with the Relief Society of Tigray, REST, as a social advisor to the executive director and then head of research policy. She then returned to Ireland to complete her PhD on smallholder agriculture and female-headed households in Tigray. Fiona has worked since as a lecturer in development studies and as an independent researcher and consultant for organizations including REST, Irish Aid, UNFO, and Tufts University. Thank you again, and I now pass you on to the moderators. I wish you a successful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eden. It's most kind of you. I don't know whether people can actually see me or the moderators, the organizers have to change the view on the screen. But that's not something I can do. Can I just say that we are very, very tight for time, and each of the people who are going to speak have 15 minutes. Those that are discussants have 10, and beyond that is really going to be tight, because otherwise we're not going to fit this in. So with your permission, I'm going to give a 2-minute warning to people when we're coming up to time, because we've lost now nearly 20 minutes of this this seminar, which is a great pity. I think there's some really important things that we have to do. The first speaker, we're very privileged to have Professor Mukesh Kapila, who is Emeritus Professor in Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester, but that doesn't even begin to touch the sides of what he does. He is one of the great humanitarians of our age, somebody who genuinely feels about the people of this world and who has done more than almost anyone else to try to stand by them under all circumstances. Mukesh, it's an honor to have you and a real privilege. You have now 15 minutes and I'll give you 2-minute warning just before the end. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to our Tigrayan friends for inviting us along to have this discussion. My brief, as I understand it, is not so much to talk about Tigray, because I think there'll be others who will doing that, but to try and set some kind of a global reflection on genocides. And unfortunately, I've become a student of genocide, not out of any great career ambition of mine, but simply finding myself in situations such as Rwanda, Darfur, Srebrenica, and also been to other places like Cambodia, which have been the scenes of genocides within living memory. And I mean, what are the reflections I can share from them, which may apply to the situation in Tigray? Well, for starters, what I've learned is that genocides are state crimes. If you go into history from the time that the word was invented in the shadow of the Second World War, and indeed even before the word genocide, certainly from Nazi times onwards, many people have committed many atrocities on each other as groups fight in many countries around the world, you see. But to my knowledge, nobody has committed a genocide unless you happen to be a state. So when we speak about genocide in Tigray, the principal responsibility is that of the state of Ethiopia. And the reason why only states commit genocide is because the commissioning of genocide requires a degree of organization and a degree of planning, a degree of orchestration of the capacities that are necessary to discharge the genocide, and that is only available to states. So, of course, movements and all sorts of movements commit terrible crimes and terrible atrocities and war crimes and so on, but only states commit genocide. And it's very important to keep that in mind as we reflect on Tigray's experience and see where it fits in. And I think what I see in Tigray is actually no different than in many of the other situations that I have, genocidal situations that I have borne witness to. The only difference is that the means by which the atrocities are committed are different because of the context and times and the technologies that are available. So when I was in Rwanda, and I was the first British government official to go into Rwanda during the 100 days of killings, I remember meeting President Kagame literally a few hours after he took control of Kigali. And it was very, very clear. And as the events unfold, as I saw for myself in Rwanda, the technology being used by the Rwandans was using what they had in hand, which was agricultural instruments and such like. And here I'm wanting to illustrate 2 points. That whereas the Rwandan government orchestrated the grand vision of the Rwandan genocide, meaning they had the conceptual idea, they had the command and control, they had the organization, and they had the information systems and communication systems to orchestrate the last genocide of the last century. But genocides are, you can't kill hundreds of thousands of people just by state armies doing it. So what happened in the case of Rwanda was And exactly the same thing happened in the case of Darfur, at that which time I was head of the United Nations in Sudan, was that the state perpetrators, in this case, the Rwanda government of that time or the Sudanese government of the time, they basically mobilized, motivated, organized, and provided the command and control and support arrangements to allow ordinary people to go and commit mass crimes. I mean, even if you had the kind of most sophisticated army in the world, the rate of killing in Rwanda or the rate of killing in Darfur is not possible for just an army to do it. And fundamentally, what these governments did was they multiplied their forces by mobilizing other communities who then did the work for them in the streets, in the neighborhoods, in the homes, in the villages, in the farms, in the towns, and so on. Armies can't do that. And I see the same things happening here in Ethiopia, because here you see the Ethiopian government leading the charge on genocide. Of that, I have no doubt. But it is not possible for the Ethiopians to do it on their own without mobilizing the population or enough segments of the population to join the effort. So, and that's the tragedy of Tigray, that we can blame the government, as we rightly need to hold accountable, in the way Hitler was held accountable, in the way that the president of Sudan was held accountable. But in the end, it is the responsibility also of the peoples who join in to commit those crimes, whether the militias of various neighboring states of Tigray or others. So that's my kind of general point. The third point I want to make in generality from experiences, that the same pattern appears again and again and again. It doesn't matter whether you talk about Tigray or whether you talk about Rwanda or you talk about Cambodia. It's the same thing. Sexual violence is always present. And sexual violence is present. There's nothing sexual about it. What there is about that particular form of violence is that it is an attempt to, in a sense, humiliate, embarrass, and utterly demoralize your enemy. And because female fertility has such a symbolic value in all cultures, everywhere in the world, when you violate that, you're violating the very essence and spirit and soul of a people. And for example, in the case of Darfur, I had the Janjaweed who was saying, as they were doing mass rapes, they were saying, okay, we are going to give you Arab babies now. Now, the Genocide Convention recognizes this, and that is why sexual crimes conducted in the context of those kinds of contexts are recognized as a qualifying act for a genocide. So, and exactly is the same things that I have been reported from Tigray. The other commonality is that all genocides try to destroy the means of living. So, because after all, if a genocide is about annihilating an enemy, a group, based on their identity, then you have to do everything possible to do it. So in the case of Darfur, what they did was they destroyed the fragile water systems, the wells, which, as you know, it's a Sahelian region, and that is an extremely part of survival. So basically, they destroyed it in such a way that not only did it destroy the means of life, the whole point was to ensure that ethnic cleansing was permanent, so that people did not come back to their villages and towns because the means for sustaining life were destroyed. So when you looked at the pattern of genocide, you're not just looking at mass killings and horrible atrocities, but fundamentally, whether that pattern of atrocity is intended to eliminate a people permanently from a scene. And in the case of Tigray, we are seeing that, and we're seeing it now in terms of the humanitarian blockade, which, by the way, makes eminent sense. What is the point of humanitarian aid or allowing humanitarian aid when your intention is to eliminate a bunch of people because of their identity or whatever reason you may have for that? Now, people often ask, well, you know, and this is especially true of this whole debate about is it genocide, is it not genocide? And then people say, oh, well, what difference does it make? After all, whether you're raped as part of a genocidal act, or whether you're just raped as part of a mass atrocity, or whether you are just raped as a criminal act, the impact on the person is the same. Similarly, there's malnutrition. Doesn't matter whether you're being malnourished because you're being starved because of what's going on in Tigray, or are you being starved because the country is poor? What does it matter, if you like? In my opinion, it really does matter, because we know from speaking to the survivors of genocide and the victims, if you like, the victims who survived, that the psychological aspects of the act of atrocity is a dimension of the intention of the act, which may or may not be genocidal. So genocide is a state of mind as much as it is a state of physical atrocity. So the patterns of atrocities and the way they are conveyed, including the hate speech, of course, which everyone knows about, so I'm not concentrating on that, but every other situation I know of it has happened, they are always accompanied by a psychological warfare. The psychological warfare goes in terms of symbolization of the acts that are perpetrated, not just a hate speech, which is self-explanatory. And in Tigray, we see this, if you like, in all the dynamics that are exposed on the media or the social media or such like. Finally, let me finish by asking about, does it matter when you declare a genocide? Now, I'm afraid one of the sad facts of history is that not a single genocide in history has ever been prevented. It has been stopped, and it hasn't been prevented, it has been stopped. And the stopping always requires armed force. So in the case of Cambodia, the Vietnamese had to march in to stop it. In the case of Rwanda, Kagame and his bunch of people in Uganda had to come back and stop it because the UN had failed. In the case of Srebrenica and so on, you had the NATO forces doing that. And I would suggest that in the case of Tigray, there is no solution to this, in that the solution we already had, in the sense that the Tigray forces basically stopped the genocide in its tracks by an armed intervention using its own internal capacities, because of course there was no foreign intervention. The problem with labels of genocide is that they're only usually applied by historians and pathologists, because by the time you've declared a genocide, the act is done. And therefore, I have come around to thinking, after maybe 15, 20 years of experiencing genocides at the front line, during the act of genocide, I have been in Rwanda, in Srebrenica, and so on. It's not about studying it from outside, but actually watching it as it unfolded, not realizing what was happening, but quickly trying to get my head around what was happening literally in front of you. And as a doctor and as a public health person, I had been taught about the precautionary principle. So in the case of COVID, what are we doing? People started locking down. Whether or not you agree in lockdown is another strategy, but the point
2 minutes, please.
Yeah. We understood that locking down was an important part just in case the epidemic got worse. So we took a precautionary approach to it. It's called the precautionary principle in public life. So for example, when one aeroplane has an accident, all the different planes of that particular brand are said, stop, let us check all aeroplanes. And that's a precautionary principle. So I consider that declaring genocide or a de facto genocide, if it is to have a preventive aspect, must be declared early, rather than so late that only a criminal court or historians or archaeologists will determine whether or not in the year 2020, 2021, a genocide was committed in Tigray or not. That's of no satisfaction to any of us. That's why I think our duty is that if it think it smells of genocide, if it tastes of genocide, if it looks like genocide against the bigger background, then it's better to assume it's genocide and argue about the legal details later on in life. And I believe this is what we need to do in the case of Tigray. Thank you.
Mukesh, that was really remarkable. It's a masterly summary of the situation. Thank you so much for that. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Fiona.
Thank you, Martin, and welcome to everyone to the seminar. This webinar is obviously a very, very timely one in the week when the report from the UN and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has come out on the issue of war crimes in Tigray. So I'm very honored and happy to introduce our next speaker, who I think is going to address the report and comment on the report, and that's Hailemariam. He's a graduate of Berkeley School of Law and University of California. He's the co-chair of the Governance, Peace and Security Committee of the Global Society of Tigray Scholars and Professionals and chair of their US branch. And he's been a regular writer and commentator on political affairs in Ethiopia. So moving on, Isaias, are you there ready to speak?
Yes, thank you very much.
And unmuted, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you, the Mahata UK and the Tigray Youth Network and all of you. And I feel honored to be here today with such distinguished and accomplished personalities who've done a lot to humanity and who are very familiar with what's going on in Tigray. And I'm very honored. Thank you. So I think a lot have been said, and Professor Mukesh put it very well. And I don't have a lot of things to add, but I think I'll be talking about a little bit about the recent UN Human Rights Commission report and what that means in terms of the accountability for the crime of genocide committed in Tigray. So I think there's one thing we should be aware of is that effective investigation of atrocities. It means a lot to victims because the recognition and accountability of criminal responsibility of genocide hinges upon or depends on effective investigation. If there's no investigation, the perpetrators will not be held accountable. So I think investigation is so very important. So without further ado, I will go detail about the most recent UN Human Rights Commission reports and what it means to Tigrayans. So as most of you know, on November the 3rd, UN Human Rights Commission and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission joint investigative team released their findings or report. And the report says it covers about 9 months of the atrocities, which means about 75% of the period so far. And some of the violations included in the reports claims that they may constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and it doesn't make any specific reference to genocide, unfortunately. And among the core crimes committed based on the reports, extrajudicial executions, forced disappearance, illegal detention, breach of economic, social, and cultural rights, and blockade of humanitarian aid. These were the major violations committed based on the report. But the joint investigation failed in many ways, unfortunately. First, somehow the report tries to justify that the Tigrayan forces started the war, even though it doesn't say it explicitly. So that's flawed and wrong in many ways, and there's a reason for that. First, in April 2018, when the new prime minister took office, the prime minister and the Fano militia and the Eritrean President Isaias, they have been preparing to subjugate Tigray. They've been preparing. There was extensive military training. There was a military parade, and in a capital city and different parts of Ethiopia, there was a televised presser by the prime minister threatening to take action against Tigray if Tigray held election. Unfortunately, as most of you know, Tigray held election, local election, and the prime minister took action. That means there was intent to start this war back in 2018. Unlike some people or some international organizations and the media, they don't have a clear image of what's going on, who started the war and why. And I think that the truth of the matter is that the Prime Minister was preparing to invade Tigray since 2018. And immediately before the war, Abiy sent special commandos and through helicopter and possibly to engage in some kind of coup. But the commandos were routed from Lula Banaga airport. And that was the start of the war. Basically, the Prime Minister was trying to topple the Tigrayan government. And that was the main reason why we're here today, and unfortunately. So I completely disagree with the report implying that the Tigrayan forces started the war. That was the first fundamental wrong about the report. And second, the reports, the major atrocities in Tigray were never covered. That's very unfortunate. You know, Mariam Dangalat, Humera, Malala, and most of the cry was not covered. Even the Axum massacre was barely covered. It's not covered very well. So I think that makes it very flawed. For example, while several dead bodies of Tigrayans were found in Sudan, different rivers in Sudan, the report just makes a scant mention of the atrocities in Western Tigray, very unfortunately. In Sudan, as most of you know, tens of thousands of Tigrayans were physically and mentally, with mental and physical harm, are there. Like, they wanted to testify about the atrocities, what they suffered, but the report doesn't cover anything about the refugees in Sudan who have witnessed the atrocities in person, and they were not even interviewed. Most of these refugees, they have directly experienced the trauma, the killing in Maikara and different parts of Tigray. However, the joint investigation didn't even reach out to some of these people. So it was flawed in terms of coverage. The Maikara report, as most of you know, was compiled just a few days after the alleged violation, and therefore it's a premature report, basically. However, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission director, he was quick. He was quick enough to publish this report, extensive report, more than 100 pages. So you can imagine the bias and in this report. So initially, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission director, Daniel, refused to investigate the Axum massacre. I remember during a televised presser, he was asked to investigate the Axum massacre, and he replied, because of the security concern, I'm not able to, I can't go to Tigray and investigate. So imagine that now he has a very detailed report accusing Tigray use of committing crimes. So obviously there is conflict of interest and bias throughout this process. And I think there are certain things we should be taking into consideration. There are core principles of international investigation of atrocity crimes. The first one is transparency. Throughout this process, the joint investigation, there's no terms of reference. I'm not aware of any TOR. We've been trying to reach out the UN and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission joint investigative team, but their terms of reference are unknown. And there's no institutional and personal independence throughout this process. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, as most of you know, is an institution established by the Ethiopian government. The director and the entire institution is under the Ethiopian government's payroll. Actually, the Dr. Daniel, the director of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, was handpicked by the Prime Minister himself. So you can imagine the personal and institutional independence issue there. And there was no witness protection mechanism in place. So most of these witnesses of Tigrayans are afraid to testify. If they testify, they could be killed or arrested. So in fear of retaliation, most people didn't even participate in this investigation process. And the other thing is the report lacks thoroughness. So thoroughness is one of the requirements of an effective investigation. The report mentions abuses in general terms, but there's no detail or extent, and we're not even aware of the scale of the atrocities. So obviously it failed. And obviously there's conflict of interest. So, you know, in natural justice principle, you can't be a judge in your own case. So obvious. So like I said, Dr. Daniel, the commissioner, was handpicked, and he has very objective and credible conflict of interest, which we are aware, ethnic and political bias. So with that, there's conflict of interest. We try to make this clear. We try to bring this to the UN attention. However, they went on and conducted an investigation regardless. So in general, this investigation does not meet the requirements of international investigation in terms of transparency, institutional independence, and thoroughness, and the presence of conflict of interest. And in general, the joint investigation was a disaster. So I think my recommendation is that only UN mandated independent investigation is the only way out. There's a reason for that. Obviously, the UN is, in terms of institution, UN is independent, well-resourced, and the special rapporteurs will have a profound experience in terms of investigation. So there is a very compelling reason why this investigation should be conducted through only UN mandated or independent international investigation afresh. What the international community thinks about the UN report is, I think, is of importance. At first, as if some of you were able to see, the Human Rights Watch has released a report, a very detailed report regarding these UN investigation results. In the report at the bottom, it says an impartial and independent investigation is commendable. That means that Human Rights Watch, which is one of the most reputable and respected organizations in terms of human rights protection investigation, disagrees with UN findings. That's the one thing. And I think one thing we should be aware of as well is the US take on this. The United States passed an independent bill, which was supported by both the Republicans and Democrats, just a day after the UN report was released. The title of the bill was, I think, Ethiopia Peace and Democracy Promotion Act of 2021. So in the report, the US government or Senate disagrees with the UN findings and recommends independent investigation afresh. So from this, the conclusion is that international organizations and United States and other countries have disagreed with UN's findings. So I think this is very critical. And I think today we're commemorating the 1-year anniversary of the Tigray genocide. And I think I will try to make a nexus or a connection with genocide and the need for an independent investigation. Obviously, I agree with Professor Mukesh that recognizing genocide after the fact, after it happened, serves little or nothing because people already died. But however, I think sometimes there's recognizing the genocide could be of importance, I think, and there are reasons for that.
3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. First, for reparation and satisfaction, and also I think to avoid repetition of the same atrocities, recognizing genocide is, I think, very important. And there is a reason for that, because factually recognizing genocide and recognizing genocide by law, de facto versus de jure, is very different. In the US, for example, they have their own law. The definition of genocide is not based on the Geneva Convention. The US has defines genocide based on Section 8 of the US Code. So I think we all have to advocate, in our respective countries to have the word recognize the Tigray genocide as genocide. If you know, I don't know if you're familiar, the Armenian genocide took place about almost 100 years ago, but it took almost 106 years to recognize it as genocide, and there are reasons for that. And I think we have to push for or advocate that the genocide in Tigray should be recognized as such. Obviously, there are multiple reasons for that. And there is a pending bill in the US that tries to recognize the Tigray genocide as genocide. And I ask each one of you to work with your respective legislators and public officials so that the Tigray genocide is recognized as genocide. I think I'm running out of time, and thank you all for the opportunity and a wonderful time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. I think there has been general widespread disappointment with the report that has come out, and I think you've identified very, very clearly some of the specific reasons for that and the problems inherent in that report. There will obviously be more detailed discussions around this over time, but I will at this point pass back to Martin for, I think we'll have a summary of what's been said so far and move on then to further discussion and questions and answer. And I'm sure you'll be able to come back then and elaborate some of those points. Thank you very much indeed, Martin.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Those are both really fascinating contributions. And Mukesh, I think the point that you were making about the precautionary principle is an absolutely invaluable one. I don't see how it would be used in practice. I think it would be extremely difficult, of course, in a live situation because of the intense political problems that there would be from that. But it is clearly an absolutely vital one. And I think it is something that we need to investigate as an international community. I mean, I'm only one citizen, but the precautionary principle clearly is important. And in a sense, we've already got there because of the idea, which has been now accepted, of the right to protect and the need for the right to protect, which is now entrenched in the United Nations. Now, this is an extension of that in a sense, and I think that is invaluable. Sayas, I think the points that you made were also really fascinating. Let me, and particularly the point that you made about the Armenian genocide and the 106 years it took for it to be recognized, which is just appalling. I mean, what is the point? There was actually a point, of course, for the Armenian community, and the Turks fought tooth and nail to stop it happening, but it has finally been recognized. So that is an achievement. But, I think just to be as fair as possible on the authors of the report, I think we should not forget that this is now a United Nations document, which does, and an Ethiopian government document, which is now recognizes that these atrocities did take place. Now, I accept all of your criticism of it, but the fact that it is now part of the record and is part of there is really important. And the remarks that Michelle Bachelet, as the UN head of this, made, in which she recognized that most of the atrocities were in fact carried out by Eritrea and Ethiopia. And let us not forget that the Tigrayans themselves have accepted that things may have gone wrong from time to time, and have said that they are willing to have an open and transparent investigation, which I think is an excellent move forward. Anyway, I won't take any more time. Let me now pass back to Fiona so that she can introduce the discussants. Fiona.
Thank you. Maybe just to add to that a little bit, I did, in terms of the report, I did try. It's difficult to be objective, clearly, for anybody who's been following events of the last year, but I did try and take a step back and look at it as a professional researcher in terms of its report. And I think while, yes, there has been an acknowledgement in some parts that most of the alleged crimes have been carried out by Eritrean and Ethiopian and Amhara forces, I think the way the report is framed has unfortunately led to widespread false equivalence again, which has kind of predominated through coverage of this conflict over the past year, and that I would have liked to have seen more distinction made in terms of the alleged crimes as to who was actually alleged to have done what, and some more information and breakdown on the scale. So moving on, and I'm sure some of these points will be taken up, we have three discussants who will speak for up to 10 minutes each, commenting on what's been said so far and adding their own views and reflections on that. And we'll be starting with Professor Galaudius, who is Professor of International and African Studies at the City University of New York. He's also founder and president of the Institute for Development and Education for Africa. So I would like to pass on to you, and you have up to 10 minutes to comment on what's been covered in the webinar so far. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Fiona, for that introduction. But apparently I was assigned to become a discussant.
That's right.
But in any case, I can make some comments. It doesn't matter. A discussant at the very end of the panel, the full panel, distinguished panels. But
Just sorry to make the point, those are the two main speakers. Previous speakers who had been scheduled to appear were unable to do so. So this is moving into the full discussant.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Question and answer session.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's okay.
That's fine.
Thank
So what
you.
I can do actually now is so that I can systematically present myself with respect to genocide in Tigray. I would first make a reflection on Professor Kapila's and Mr. Isaias Hailemariam's presentations. But I would like to elaborate also on the definition of genocide itself, because so many people are confused. What's genocide? What is ethnic cleansing? It's not clearly defined. So what I actually like about Professor Kapila's presentation is in terms of his global reflection on genocide. And what I found it very interesting actually is his state genocide nexus is always connected to the state. The state actually perpetrates, not the individual people, but the state itself as a whole. However, we should not also lose sight the fact that the state is, in one instance, led by individual people, like Abiy Ahmed in the case of Ethiopia and Isaias Afwerki in the case of Eritrea. So they play a major role in the perpetration of genocide, and as such, they must be held accountable. We cannot sue the state, but we can sue individuals as well. Because I have had some conversations or email exchange with ICC, and they are mostly interested in individuals, persons who committed genocide. And in any case, what I also like about Mr. Kapila's analysis is genocides are, in many ways, they have a lot in common, but the degree, their degrees could differ. Ultimately, also, of course, the state is responsible because the state organized and mobilized the people to commit genocide. That's obvious to everybody, I guess. But the other thing that is that has been discussed is with respect to rape of women. It's deliberately done to demoralize the people, not only the rape victim, but the entire society, so that they can eliminate them permanently as people. I like that very much, the way it's put. And then when it comes to Mr. Isaias's presentations, I agree with him that that I have read that long report of the joint, so-called joint report. Actually, superficially, it looks like it's a balanced report, but I have actually underscored so many errors in the report. To begin with, like Isaias said, they thought, like the government of Ethiopia claims all the time, that the Tigrayan forces are responsible for the provocation of the war because they attacked the central command, the northern command, which is actually wrong, because long before November 4, when Abiy Ahmed declared war on Tigray, the special Amhara forces, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, were in Tigray already. The fighting had begun a week before in Tigray. And then ultimately, of course, from the northern part of Tigray, the Eritrean Defense Forces joined them. So Tigray was attacked from four corners, actually. And the other failure of the report is that I was actually dismayed completely, because it says, it tries to make distinction between a local war and an international war. And by the definition the report has made, the Tigray war or the Ethiopia conflict is local, it's not international. It's actually completely wrong, because how about Eritrea was involved? The Somali forces were involved. The United Arab Emirates employing drones were involved. So many foreign forces were involved actually in the Tigray war. That makes it international. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not only international, it's a geopolitical war. The Tigray thing is a geopolitical war, if we can expand it, because the Arabs were involved. United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia was involved. And if you follow the United Nations Security Council, 10 meetings on Tigray alone. All the time, China and Russia were on one side, actually supporting the government of Abiy Ahmed. And then the Russian government, until very recently, now they said, of course, it has to be resolved peacefully. But consistently, they were supporting the Abiy Ahmed regime. They even justified the Eritrean occupation of Tigray. So that makes it international too. We have to have a look at that. The other thing that Mr. Isaias raised is the involvement of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Long before the United Nations Human Rights Commission actually started its investigation, I and my friends from the United States have contacted them and told them they have to do it independently, because if they do it along with the Ethiopian, so-called Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, they might actually mislead them. And one other thing that they did not do is they have not gone to some places that we actually proposed, like Mariam Dingalat and then Mahabera Dego, where they were shooting and throwing off the victims of the hill. They did not go there. They did not talk to the people. They have not gone to Aksum. They have gone to Aksum, but they have not talked to the people. They did not go to Mariam Dingalat as well, where hundreds and thousands of people were massacred. This was a failure on the part of the reports. The other thing I want to make clear before I finish, as I have begun actually, is there is this gross misconception with respect to the definition of genocide. People think genocide, actually a lot of people associate genocide with a wholesale massacre of people. That's only part of it. According to the Geneva Convention of 1946 and then ratified in 1948. And by 2018, of course, we all know that that Geneva Convention is now ratified by 149 countries. According to them, actually, and then, by the way, including the Ram Statute, including ICC Article 6, clearly defines that genocide means killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm. It's not just killing the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group imprisoning measures intended to prevent births of the group, like they've done in Tigray, according to our accounts, which was never covered by the report, the UN Human Rights Commission. Here in the United States, I have a group called Tigray Global Advocacy Group. And we found out that actually more than 10,000 girls and women were victimized with wholesale rape thing they've done in Tigray. And then they were not only raping them, they were mutilating their body parts. They were mutilating completely so that they cannot continue not only as individual people, as human beings as well. They were totally demoralized. So they were mutilating their private parts. And then, of course, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This has been thousands of children were disappeared from Tigray, actually. All these items I just mentioned constitute genocide. It's not just wholesale massacre. So by all accounts, genocides have been committed in Tigray. But unfortunately, neither the United States nor the United Nations Security Council are talking about genocide. I don't know why. So that's what I want to conclude, but I may continue at the end of the panel as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was particularly useful, I think, in clarifying the concept of genocide and a reminder that it's not just about numbers or scale, and it's not specific to killings, but has a much wider remit in terms of what's termed as genocide. And again, highlighting some of the particular problems and issues around the report. I'd like to move on now to Dennis Wadley, who is the international director of Bridge of Hope. And I think is probably known to most of you for having smuggled out the recording of His Holiness Abuna Matthias's statement on what was happening in Tigray and the extent to which he was being silenced by the government earlier on in May this year. So if we could hear from Dennis Wadley. You're there?
Thank you, Fiona. Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, and for Martin as well for hosting. You know, what I feel like I have to offer is my wife and I went to Tigray, and we were there in Mekelle in April. We went with the intent, we've been working there for the last decade in a master's program, training people in leadership and community development, and had talked to our friends there who were running one of the IDP camps. And when the G7 had said that the military should clear out, we reached out and just said, would it be helpful for us to come? My wife does training in helping people deal with trauma. And so we thought, you know, we'll train up some people who can train others, because there's been so much trauma. And when we got there, you know, the city of Mekelle was still fully occupied. There were murders that were happening while we were there. What we were able to bring to this discussion was firsthand testimony, and the testimony of women who had been raped, the testimony of children who were fleeing from their communities. When one little girl, she was 13 years old, she was fleeing with her uncle, and he was murdered and shot in the back. You know, this was not military action. This was an attempt to eliminate people, and especially people who would be a fighting age at that point. and now children who, she ended up making her way to Mekelle. She was separated from all family. They've been searching and searching and had not been able to find any of her family members in all the different IDP camps. There was another little girl, 5 years old, fleeing with her mother and her grandmother, and she was shot in the knee. They were worried she was going to bleed out. But again, innocent victims in the midst of this. And then the testimonies that we heard, my wife was just spending time in the IDP camps, just listening to people's stories. And, when you look at the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, as has been mentioned, that, killing members of the group, well, that's clearly happening, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Incredibly, true due to the rape, and then especially the harm done to children and the fear that people were living in, the bombings that were taking place, not military bombings in the city of Mekelle and around Mekelle while we were there. There was a group of young people when we were in Mekelle who were standing at a bus stop, and just because too many had congregated in one place waiting for a bus, they came in and just gunned them down. And it was purported to be the Eritrean military that did that. The other elements, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part. That is undeniable with the blockade of aid and the blockade of food to the region. With the desire, when they went into the towns, the testimonies that we were recording, they were not just, pursuing people in the military. They were going in and completely destroying people's farms, emptying the silos, burning the crops, destroying the implements that people would need to be able to farm in the future. And again, clearly fitting the description of what genocide is, inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. It is undeniable that that is what was taking place. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. When you look at the rape and the sexual, mutilation that has been described, and the testimonies that have come out and the things that have been published by so many in the news, it was just, again, completely undeniable. And so, again, what we had to offer was testimony. When we went to Addis, one of the things that caught my attention was there were billboards up around Addis, and they were celebrating, the end of the Rwandan genocide. And it was just so bizarre to think, here they are celebrating, that the genocide had ended, however many years ago in Rwanda, while at the same time committing genocide in Tigray. When I met with His Holiness Abune Matthias, he shared with me some of the things that were recorded, but also just, that he had heard all these reports, that he had clear testimony to the fact that this was a genocide. And that is why he had repeatedly tried to get his message out. Each time, the 3 previous attempts, his message was not only thwarted, but the people who carried his message out had been arrested. And he said that he had been threatened, and that he had been threatened that if he spoke, not only would his life be in danger, but the bishops and the others around him, their lives would be in danger, or they would be murdered. And he repeatedly said, "I'm not fearful for my own life," but he said, "I'm fearful for the lives of those around me." But he knew that the time had come, that his message needed to get out to the world, that he needed to be a leader in the nation. 60 million of 110 million Ethiopians are Orthodox. He needed to take a stand and declare that genocide was happening. And that is, what his message, was clearly also declaring. So anyway, I hope that the message getting out, that the message, going around the world will continue to help people evaluate, what has taken place. The report from the UN clearly, failed in accomplishing that task. But I do believe from the testimony that we heard, as well as the testimony of Abune Matthias, that it is undeniable that what is taking place and has taken place in Tigray is genocide. It's so good that you're doing what you're doing, that these messages, 1 year in on this, are going out. And hopefully what we can continue to do together is to testify to this and to rally others who will be willing to stand. My hope is that the war will soon be over, that this will lead to a transformation in the government, and that this will become an example of something that will never happen again. We need to get in place a global commitment, that will move into action when we begin to see something that looks like genocide, not years after a genocide has moved into action. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. It's important in the middle of all the arguments about the legal aspects of the report to be reminded, and very sobering to be reminded, of the actual stories and the individuals behind this report. And I thank you very, very much for that. Yeah. I'd now like to move on to our third and final discussant, Dr. Tsigai Ararsa, who's a legal expert, and particularly in constitutionalism and federalism, and has been operating as an academic for many years and as a consultant, and worked with the United Nations Development Programme on issues around governance and human rights. So if you would like to make your comments and your contributions, Dr. Tsigai, you have 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Apologies, Fiona. Dr. Tsigai couldn't join us because of technical difficulties. Can we move on to the next speaker, please?
Okay, thank you very much for that. I will, in that case, hand you back to Martin, who's going to introduce. There are some people who want to raise some questions, I believe, of our panel. So I'll hand you back to Martin then for that section of the programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Very kind. Let me just say one word about Dennis Wadley and what he has done. I mean, it was, to be honest, it was Dennis contacting me and speaking to me and providing the testimony that he did, the first-hand testimony, which convinced me beyond all doubt about what was going on and the reality of the situation. And I think we should look, of course, for Tigrayans to speak on their own behalf is absolutely vital. But of course, the world, and particularly journalists like myself, will always be suspicious. Let me be frank about it, about testimony from a group that is involved. But for Dennis, to come up and stand with you and speak on, in a sense, on from his own experience, was incredibly important. And, I would just like to pay tribute to Dennis for what he has done, of course, not just in this instance, but for many years. And it was incredibly helpful. Dennis, thank you. Let me just say that we're now going to move on. We have a little bit more time than we thought we were going to have. So I hope we will give a bit more time to the following three people who are going to come in, and I hope they're all here. It's Hannah Haile, Mulu Bayani, and Jerusalem Barnabas. Each of you to have, in turn, a question to any of the panelists or a brief point you would like to make. Please do so. Let's not have a whole speech if you don't mind, but let's begin with Hannah, if you are here. I don't see Hannah.
Hannah is also not managed to join because of unforeseen circumstances. Sorry.
Okay, well, shall we then move on to Mulu? Are you here, Mulu?
And Mulu as well, sorry.
Okay. Jerusalem then. Jerusalem, would you mind switching on your video if you can? I can see that you're here. It'd be good to have you and also to see you, if we may. Mulu, you have the floor and a considerable period of time at your disposal. So please go ahead and ask any of the discussants or the speakers a question or a couple of questions. But you need to unmute yourself.
Is that me, Martin, or?
That's you.
Oh, okay.
You're next.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to say thank you for the organizers and also for the distinguished speakers. It's quite interesting to listen to every one of you. We're grateful for that. But I want to say thank you for the people of Tigray who have survived and persevered through what has been going on. I'm honored, to be honest, to have people like this who've been fighting 1 year on to this genocidal war. So my question is going to be basically on what Professor Mukesh said. Professor Mukesh said something that I found interesting. It is that, by the time genocide is committed, it is already done. So, you can't stop it, which means it is a premeditated, state-supported, organized, probably properly orchestrated act. So what I'm trying to say here and what I would like to ask is, Tigrayans in Ethiopia have been saying since Abiy came, at least since 2018, that, there is a dehumanization, vilification, criminalization, harassment, and extrajudicial killing, name calling, and all kinds of things before the war happened. There were generals that were killed in their own house. Abiy was calling Tigrayans, the daylight hyenas. People were all then calling them the daylight hyenas. Every crime that was committed in the last 27 years of the reign of EPRDF was blamed on Tigrayans. So for everything that happened in Ethiopia, Tigrayans were blamed. So what I would like to ask is, in fact, if genocide is a premeditated act to harm, to erase a community because of their ethnicity or cultural background. And the Tigrayans have been screaming for this before the war started to the international community. Nobody heard. And once the act happened as well, when the war started, when Tigrayans were saying there is another state, because this is, in fact, a two-state sponsored war, the Eritrean government and the Ethiopian government. Never mind about the Somalis and the drones of UAE and the others, but two states. One is a neighboring state, colluding with a state of Ethiopia. Having plotted this thing to happen, on the November war, the international community literally denied as if nothing was happening. Why do you think that is? Also, the international world, especially the United Nations Security Council, don't you think they have failed with all the atrocity that has been happened, whether it is a weaponized sexual violence, whether it is a weaponized starvation, whether it is a deliberate blockout of electricity and every internet and transportation, every system. Why is it the United Nations failed to respect its own UN Convention on Genocide? And also, to make it worse, on its report, it denies, one, it involved, the criminal as a judge or as an investigator. And two, it wants to deny that, this was a genocide. Why do you think that is? And what has the world learned from Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and Cambodia, and all other genocide wars that have happened in the world? So are they not culpable? Isn't the UN culpable of this genocidal act that happened in Tigray? It is still happening. People in Addis are harassed, arrested, detained, disappearing. All this is happening. What do you think it is? I want to direct my question to Professor Mukesh, and also, what Dennis said, and Professor Galaudios, as well as Isaias. Thank you to all of you.
If just to quickly respond to that, Thank you very much. I can feel the kind of frustration and disappointment, which is so evident, especially when, the UN is the most precious instrument. It is almost like a sacred symbolic expression of the aspirations of the whole of humanity. And when that is disappointed, then the hurt is even more. The way to analyze this is to first ask, what is the UN? And the UN is not just an amorphous creature, it is composed of individuals. And certainly in my own case, when I was tackling the Darfur genocide as the head of the UN in the Sudan, what was frustrating was the lack of support from my then boss, the late Kofi Annan, and long may he rest in peace. But the fact was that in the end, I had to speak up in public and get the media on my side because my bosses in New York were not responding. So the question to ask our friend in Jerusalem is not the UN, but who in the UN is blocking? Because unless you have individual identification of that, you're not going to progress any further. In this case, Antonio Guterres is probably the weakest Secretary General we've had in recent decades. And he, of course, was in the middle of his re-election campaign at the same time as the earliest things were happening in the Tigray war. And the last thing he was going to do was to speak up to say anything strong in case it cost him any votes. So that's one fundamental thing. The second thing is, it doesn't hurt people. I mean, who really cares what goes on in Tigray? There's horrible bad things happening in every country in the world, everywhere. So there is a certain callousness. I remember, going up to the 38th floor of the Secretary General during my time in the UN and looking down on the street of the First Avenue, and the people looked like cockroaches because it was so tiny. So when you are in office at a high level, you are far above all of this. So when the Rwandans and the Sudanese and even, who knows, the Ethiopians, they talk about insects or cockroaches, for me, it brings back to the view from the office of the Secretary General on the 38th floor, in a way. Finally, I think you have to understand that the UN has many good people and has many good institutions, for example, the humanitarian side, for example, the health side, for example, UNICEF, WHO, World Food Program, etc., etc., etc. So we have to differentiate between all of that. Now, coming finally to the point about the Security Council, this needs to be made more explicit. The number one block in the case of Tigray is China. And the reason it is China is because of the geopolitics of China's own position in relation to its mounting enmity to the Western liberal model. So, and of course, you see dictators hang together. So, and by the way, don't blame the UN all the time. What about your own African Union, which is, even in my case, the African Union was a little bit more active than the African Union is now. Admittedly, it's a hostage in Addis. And quite frankly, honestly, when the African people will not speak up, when the nations of Africa are behaving the way they are, and when the Club of African Nations is protecting its worst heinous dictators on the continent, what do you expect the UN to do? So I think the answer to this question goes right back. What kind of institutions do you have in Africa? What makes you deserve the UN should come and rescue you when you, and I don't mean you, meaning the last speaker, but I mean we as individuals, when people will not take the agency in their own hands. So fundamentally, Africans are the biggest block to UN action because of the way African politics itself runs and the way it interfaces with the global geopolitics, where the likes of China and the alliance between African dictators and Chinese and the dependencies that creates. So when you go into that geopolitics And then you try to connect that to individual responsibilities, whether it's the failure of Antonio Guterres or the failure of the leadership of the African Union, or the fact is that very senior leaders in many, many countries have said nothing. That's the questions we should be asking as to why we have that. And that's why I also come to the conclusion, solution of this lies in people's own hands. Don't expect any salvation from anyone from outside. In the end, it was the Kagame himself who came and rescued the Rwandans. Same here. I think Tigray's answer to save Tigray, what's left of Tigray people, Tigrayans will have to get on with it, win the war, replace the government, and bring about a different kind of dispensation in the state of Ethiopia.
Mukesh, thank you very much for that. I mean, it's wonderful to hear your insight from so many different situations. I remember very well your interventions in Darfur and the fact that you risked your position, quite frankly, to speak out, not just once, but many times. And if you hadn't, the situation in Darfur would have been very, very much worse. So, thank you for what you did then and what you're doing now. I'm just going to abuse my position by asking Asas one question, because and I think it's the most difficult question, which is your people have now suffered the most appalling atrocities. Let's not beat about the bush. They are awful, absolutely awful. And yet it appears, and let's not preempt things, that the Tigrayans, with 8 other organizations, which was signed in New York, this deal was signed yesterday, are likely to be running Ethiopia. How are Tigrayans going to get to a position where they will actually not hold individuals, not individuals, I mean by that, the people. I mean, obviously, the leaders should be held to account in a proper judicial process. But how are you going to stop people from inflicting the most appalling suffering on other Ethiopians when they have themselves endured so much? How is that going to take place?
Okay, thank you, Martin. I think indeed it's a very difficult question. Yes, it's a political question. I think it requires a political answer. So I'm not a political figure, but I think as individual and as a Tigrayan, I will try to reflect. Yeah, that's true. I think about 9 different political organizations have convened 2 days ago, and they formed a political union to form a transition, a peaceful transition, or armored struggle, of course, to remove the existing regime and replace a system that allows participation, diversity, and different political thinking. I think that's a good progress, and I think Tigray alone or Tigray forces alone can't solve Ethiopia's problem. Ethiopia is a very diverse country. It's a big country with almost 110 million people, with different political ideology and ethnic groups, and I think the decision to form a union and try to resolve Ethiopia's political process and future I think it's commendable, and I think there's no other option at this point in time. But I think in terms of resolving other nations and nationalities in Ethiopia, and I think they all have to struggle together. I think it's not like the Tigrayans, fought for generations, and including during the Derg regime, during the military, like 60,000 or more Tigrayans have died to remove the dictator, the communist regime 30 years ago. And I think Tigrayans should not sacrifice every time some bad regime comes in Ethiopia. And I think we have to collaborate with other ethnic groups with different interests, and I think we have to bring solution in collaboration with others. And I think even though Tigrayans have suffered a lot, and I think we still have the upper hand, or the political will to work together with others and resolve any impending threat to Tigrayans, and also threat to other ethnic groups in Ethiopia. That being said, everything happens in Ethiopia is not just about Tigrayans, and I think it also is about other ethnic groups. And I think that's the reason why the Tigrayan forces formed this union and entered into the political union to resolve this current situation.
No, thank you very much. I mean, it was actually interesting when the founding conference was held yesterday, that I think it was somebody from Gambela said, we've been treated like slaves for years, and and the racism we've endured is appalling. So clearly there are many issues which still need to be taken up, but the key thing that everyone seems to agree on is the nature of the confederate state, and one in which power is diverted from the center, and that was a really important thing they all agreed on. There are a couple more questions to you, if you don't mind. One from Asta Hagos. She says, given that the report is a watered down version of what really happened, what other international mechanisms and avenues are available for comprehensive investigation? As you rightly said, we have to push for a recognition of the Tigrayan genocide. That's from Asta.
Yeah, I think the other mechanisms are, we have different options. First, UN-only investigation as the only way out. The most viable solution is UN-mandated investigation, not working with the likes of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, which are politically biased. And I think UN-only investigation is one option. The second option is having an internationally recognized other entities, for example, countries or organizations, investigate the atrocities in Tigray. And a third option is using Tigray's own domestic mechanisms or framework. For example, Tigray can start forming a commission, for example, local commission, human rights investigation commission under Tigray laws, and probably establishing a local tribunal to try to prosecute some of these perpetrators. For example, in the past, I think 20 or 25 years ago, the Derg, the military regime, the Derg officials were tried for committing genocide under Ethiopian law. Ethiopia's criminal law allows the prosecution of genocide, actually, the criminal law. It's based on the 1948 Geneva Convention, but at the same time, there is local law. I think Tigray can also, explore options, like other options, like, using its own legal system, like the local process to investigate and prosecute perpetrators. And the other option could be, I think, Tigrayans all over the world can start exploring what we call the universal jurisdiction. There are about 12 countries, I think 11 countries with universal jurisdiction, including, I think, UK, Germany, and France as well, I guess. So this means that you don't have to go to ICC. Basically, these countries can prosecute perpetrators who are connected with the crime. So if there are people who can complain or people affected in those jurisdictions or countries, you can initiate prosecution. For example, there's a pending matter going on in Belgium. Belgium is one of the safe havens of universal jurisdiction. So I think exploring that option is also the other avenue. And finally, I think one of the participants sent me a question directly to me. If Martin allows me, I can address that in 30 seconds, I guess, about the UN and African Union failure. I mean,
please do.
Addressed it very well, but I think I have to mention a very particular example. So under the African Union Constitution or African Union Constitutive Act, Article 4H, the Union can intervene whenever there is serious human rights violation in member states. So obviously Tigray was invaded from different direction. People died, women being raped, and starvation. However, the African Union didn't take any action at all for almost 1 year. Actually, the commissioner tweeted, he said that he appreciated the Prime Minister Abiy's action, and he said, this is a law enforcement operation. We have it. He tweeted, Mr. Chairman Musa Faki. That means Africa failed. They failed us. Like, we don't have to blame it on UN. At first, like Professor Mukesh said, the African Union failed, and UN also failed. Of course, we have to agree on that. Obviously, UN is a political union. It's not a country, so it requires political will. So, for obvious reason, it failed. The UN Security Council requires unanimous decision, and it failed us multiple times. And I think that's something to be considered. And Sigab also raised a question about what's the consequence for dictators, and I think if the Tigray atrocity is not properly investigated and prosecuted, it sets the wrong precedent. So other dictators will assume that they will get away with committing crimes, and it encourages impunity, I guess. These are, I think, the questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Isaias. Very, very comprehensive and very important responses. Let me just say that there are a couple of quick points that have been made. I mean, Gail Warden makes a really important point that Professor Jan Nyssen in Ghent University, I don't know if you are all aware of his work, but he is putting together a comprehensive list, or as comprehensive as he can, of the atrocities that have been committed and as detailed as possible. That will be available and is really important, a source which everybody can then bring information to. Let me ask a question. Alison Pyle asks a question to everyone, but perhaps I should try and answer it since it's about the media. It says, if a solution lies in the hands of the people, how do we convince the international media to stop condemning the only advocates for Tigrayans as rebels? Well, yes, I'm afraid you have a good point. The Tigrayans were elected in, what was it, September 2000 last year, and in a pretty robust election, and it's not right to call them rebels. Of course, they are in rebellion against the center, but that's only a technicality. And honestly, it's a very good point. But I'm afraid you're not going to get the media to unravel all that. It's too complicated for them. I must be honest with you. There is a question from Sigad, but I think Sigab, it's about the United Nations, which and it's to Professor Mukesh. Again, given the level of genocide crimes committed in the UN, in Tigray, and the inaction of the UN, what are the implications of consequences for dictators in the world that would be learning from this? But I don't know, Mukesh, is there something you'd like to add? What you said about the role of the UN? I don't know. You may feel that you've said as much as you can.
Well, I have said the only point to make is that. There has to be individual accountability on the duty bearer. Okay, what I learned from my experience trying to move the stone up the mountain on the Darfur case was simply that when you targeted, in my case, it was Sir Kieran Prendergast, who was the Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, on whom Kofi Annan leaned and was the principal advisor, who was telling him, don't kind of use up UN's capital, political capital on this tribal dispute in a place called Darfur, if you like to see. By exposing the individual who is the bloc in any institution, whether it is in national COVID responses, as a parallel example, or in this one. So journalists and others who are investigating these kinds of things, they need to go beyond the generality and examine the anatomy of how decisions are made. Now, our American friends are very good at that, because in America, they have a tradition of lobbying their senator, their congressman, or whatever. So they get to know the position adopted by any lawmaker or any official in the American system. While what happens is that the impunity comes from officials of the international community hiding behind the anonymity of grand and big institutions. And that's what needs to be broken by the next generation of investigators and so on, to get to the point of it. For example, on the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, I see a question there. How come it happened that OHCHR got into this crass situation of agreeing to do a joint inquiry with one of the parties in the case being investigated? Now, I don't know the answer to this question, but I do know is that a few kilometers away, because I am near Geneva, is the answer is lies, and that's what we need to investigate. Because Michelle Bachelet is actually a good person, an experienced head of state, and generally a good person. So knowing who and how that happened and pinning their accountability on this absurd human rights report which is going to damaging the cause is extremely important in any investigation.
Thank you very much, Mukesh. I believe that Mekonnen Tesfaye is ready to ask a question. Mekonnen, could you unmute yourself and put on your video so we can see you? Go ahead, Mekonnen.
Thank you very much to the speakers, moderators, and discussants. My question to Professor Mukesh Kapila. In one of your tweets, he said, modern genocide don't happen Nazi style. Modern genocide happen by stealth, cheaply, through hunger, rape, starvation, and pillaging. Is this not the distinguishing feature of what has been happening in Tigray, specifically the use of hunger, starvation, and famine, and the deliberate denial of basic services such as electricity, water, telephone, transport for one whole year? Is it not one of the distinguishing feature of the genocide happening in Tigray? To Isaias, flawed as it is, what can we take as useful from the United Nations Human Rights Council report? For instance, is it the case that it leaves the door open for, or it recommends there should be an in-depth investigation? Actually, that is, if it recommends in-depth independent investigation, shouldn't we take that as a positive thing from the report?
Thank you, Mekonnen.
Well, my short answer is yes. I think gone are the days when you had mass slaughters done Nazi style or even Rwanda style. Today's genocides are very smart actions, and that's what we're seeing now in Tigray. If I could just have another 30 seconds to comment, what I worry about in terms of independent UN investigations is the executive action that follows or doesn't follow. So, of course, somebody could set up some commission or something, but only the Security Council in the international system as we know it is mandated to actually empower an investigation that will result in something like a referral to an international criminal court, for example. And in my case, that is what I was fighting for when it came to the whole Darfur business, and it eventually happened, but that's another story, see. So yes, we can call for all these UN investigations and all the rest of it, but if they are going to just happen in the way that this thing happened, even if it is not a joint one, I can't see us making progress. The core of this lies in the UN Security Council resolution. Without that, I think there is no empowerment. Nobody can refer this matter to the International Criminal Court unless it happens to be another state, which is a state party, if you like, you see. So that's extremely important, and that's where the politics comes into it.
Asais?
Thank you very much, Martin. I think Mekonnen has raised a very good question. So if the UN offers us independent investigation, should we accept it? I think that's the gist of the question, I think. Absolutely, we have to accept if there is an offer from UN to conduct independent investigation, we should accept that and we should cooperate and we should work with that. There's no question about that, because that's been what we've been asking that like since January, since immediately after the atrocities were committed. So the UN-only investigation is viable, and for many reasons, because the UN is well-equipped, well-resourced, they have experience, they are institutionally, they are independent. So we have to accept that. And I think from our own side, we have to advocate for, we have to condemn and reject the current report. I mean, even though to some extent it recognized what happened in Tigray, but I think in general, it doesn't serve the victims' interest. And I think we have to reject and advocate for an independent investigation. And that's all I have to say about the investigation. And I think the other thing connected with this is that genocide is not about numbers, actually. So the statutory definition of genocide is killing members of the group in whole or in part with the intent to destroy. So intent matters, and it's not about numbers. It can be in whole or in part. So you don't have to kill a million people to call it genocide. Even a few thousand, the killing is enough. So I think we have to make a distinction in here. Like, it's not about numbers, it's about the intent. And then I think finally,
sorry.
Okay, finally, words matter. I think when we say they're confusing words, this mass atrocities, genocide, ethnic cleansing, they're very confusing words. Mass atrocity, we call it in Tigrinya, chaf, genocide, mitfa alit, and ethnic cleansing, there is not. So I'm saying this because people speak Tigrinya who understand that. So I think we have to be very careful not to set the wrong precedent, not the wrong narrative. So I think we have to call it genocide. It is. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Araya, I wonder if I can put one question to you, which is from Leandra. And she asks this, which is, I have a question if there's time. In 2017, the ICC used evidence from social media. As open source evidence is a significant step, as Tigray genocide has been documented all over the social media. Could we use this to our advantage? Professor Araya, could you respond to that? Perhaps he's not there. Well, since he isn't there, let me put the question to Fiona, who is herself an academic and has worked in this field for a long time. What do you think?
I'm not experienced, I haven't been an academic in human rights or issues such as this, but it did strike me that the UN undertook, what was it, reasonable expectation of belief. I don't think that was quite the phrase, as their criterion or their proof of, or for factual determination of what had happened. And I found it quite surprising that there was no referral to back up documentation, because so much of it has been documented. We're not just talking about comments, even our second or third hand stories on social media. We're talking about actual videos which showed real life as they happened, massacres and extrajudicial executions, and which were located, geolocated. For instance, CNN geolocated and verified the location and timing of the people who were gunned down and thrown over cliffs, and where the Ethiopian soldiers or Eritrean soldiers were videoing and swapping images of that. I can see no reason why they don't constitute proof to a greater extent even than recollections or interviews with people.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. I see Professor Araya is back. Professor Araya, the question is, do you think social media can be used and harvested in a sense to provide evidence in taking matters in a judicial way, either to the ICC or to another court?
Thank you, Martin. Actually, you yourself mentioned Ghent early on. And we cannot completely rely on social media. Some of them, of course, are reliable, some are not. But we have massive documentation on the genocide in Tigray by reliable forces, like the European External Program, Africa, for instance, headquartered in Belgium. I myself have read 76 articles produced by the European External Program. And the videos that Fiona mentioned, actually, some of them incredibly produced by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. In the case of one place by the name Mahabere Dego, for instance, where they've executed 34 Tigrayan youths and threw them off the cliff. That video was actually produced by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. Now we know from the POWs in Tigray, they themselves are saying actually that we were there ourselves. we can make an eyewitness account. So you do not have to rely on social media all the time. We have videos, Fiona said, we have documentations like the external program days. We have so many of them actually really that came out from Tigray. So
you make a very valid point. I completely agree with you. Let
me just add one point.
Sure, please.
Giving credit to you, by the way. Matthew Plot, you've been consistently writing on Twitter on these issues and many other related issues. You yourself know a lot of what's going on in Tigray. So you are a moderator now, I understand. You want to accommodate other questions. However, you can make reflections too on what you've seen and what you've got from the year-old conflict in Ethiopia.
Well, thank you very much. We're coming to the end of this, but I would like to give both Isaias and Dennis a final say, and then perhaps hand back to Fiona if there's anything she wants to say. I agree with you that there is evidence. To be honest with you, some of the videos were so awful, so horrifying, I could not watch them. I watched a short amount of them and I just could watch no more. I mean, they were worse, in my view, than anything I saw in Rwanda. But that's just a personal observation. Let me go to Dennis first. Are there a couple of remarks you'd like to make?
Well, I would just agree with you on that, Martin. You know, the cliffs, the stories of the rapes were so heinous that was part of when I realized, you know, this is not military action. This is genocide. The intent of mutilating someone's sexual organs so that they will not be able to bear the next generation. The desired, you know, the gang rapes, the things that went on, and the stories, you know, that we've heard are just so heinous, and it was so hard to listen to, so hard to imagine the healing process going forward. And I think that's the passion. And you know, one of the things that we're now working on is just what's it going to look like to rebuild, and how do we help in the days ahead, and hopefully in the next weeks, you know, we can really get into some of those topics, as that is really my passion.
Absolutely. Yeah. Isaias, anything you want to say on this?
I think I wanted to add a little bit about evidence. Somebody asked about social media evidence, and I think in general, evidence are classified as admissible evidence and relevant evidence in criminal proceedings. So most of the social media, you know, videos and pictures may be relevant, but only admissible evidence is required to prosecute a case. So I think, but in general, well, it's not about evidence. It's not lack or abundance of evidence, but I think it's about the mechanism, the framework, and political will. So we have ample evidence. So it's not, we don't have lack of evidence. Atrocities are very clear. We have evidence, and I think we don't have to rely on social media reports. Some of them could be considered as hearsay, and some of them may be altered. So I think it's not just about the evidence, and I think the will and the framework is what matters. And that being said, and I think my final words are, you know, when you're faced with existential threats, I think fighting for survival is commendable. And I think we don't have any option but to fight and defend ourselves. This is a natural right. Thank you very much.
Think you very much. That's really helpful. Fiona, is there anything you'd like to add, or shall we hand back to the organizers?
I think I would totally agree. There is a huge amount of evidence that's already being gathered. I'm not going to go into any of that. A lot of the issues in here will be taken up again, I think, in the third webinar, where we're looking at bringing it forward, and I'll also be a moderator on that. So I'll save my powder for that seminar if we want to move on and finalize this one. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all the participants and to all the discussants and all of those who have provided questions. Really a very intense and I think helpful discussion, and I think we've moved things along somewhat. Let me finally pay tribute to people like Jerusalem and Rita, who've been working so hard to bring this together, and Salam, you know, and all the youth of Tigray who have done what they can to to make this possible. And I hand back now to Salam.
Thank you for that, Martin. To commemorate the 1 year of Tigray genocide, TYN along with Makata brings you a high-level discussions to establish the facts and acts of genocide perpetrated against the people and nationality of Tigray. This was the first of a series of discussions planned for the month of November. The intention behind these webinars is to mark the year anniversary of war on Tigray and provide a legal case of the genocide. We've been joined by some great speakers. Firstly, we had Mukesh Kapila, who drew similarities between the tragic Rwandan genocide and the current Tigray genocide. Mukesh raised a key point that genocides are state-sponsored that facilitate and mobilize civilians to carry out these extrajudicial killings. We then had Hailemariam, who stressed the importance of the thorough investigations in holding perpetrators accountable and bringing justice to those who've suffered. Contrary to the joint UN and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission investigation, where they missed key areas that were largely affected. We then moved over to a discussion where Gelaudios, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Araya, highlighted atrocities committed in Tigray are hallmarks of genocide and should be recognized as such. We then had Dennis Wadley, who visited Tigray in April with his wife and was able to share first-hand testimonies. Dennis was also able to provide us with a recording from His Holiness Abuna Matthias. We also had Fiona Mihan, who shared that videos taken by invading forces of the massacres and killings that took place were key in finding locations and details of the true extent of what is taking place in Tigray. Today's webinar aimed to explore the atrocities committed in Tigray within the scope of both the UN Convention and the Genocide on Genocide, the Roma Statute, the 11 stages of genocide, and the general international law. Next week's webinar will be an extension of today's, but we'll be listening to powerful testimonies of people who have experienced the genocide in Rwanda, Darfur, Sudan, Bosnia, and Tigray. So be sure to register if you haven't already, and we look forward to see you all there. I want to thank Martin Plaut for hosting. Thank you to all the panelists, moderators, discussants, and organizers. And thank you to everyone for attending and participating. We hope you will join us for next week's webinar.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Fiona, who also hosted.
Thank you.
Thank you.